it's Alex and welcome to Hey Little Thrifter. Today I'm going to be talking about everything I read in September. First up, I read The Cipher by Kathe Koja. This is an incredible horror novel, originally published in 1991. I did a separate review video about this, so I'll link that below if you want to check it out. But this was such a fantastic read. I absolutely loved it. I read this as a buddy read with the lovely Emily at Page Turns. I will link her channel below as well. And we both had such a great time with this book. The story follows Nicholas and Nakota, who find a hole, and they find that when they lower things into the hole, they come back transformed. And the story develops into something so unsettling and disturbing and amazing. It was just such a great read. Can't recommend it highly enough. This was a 5-star read for me. It was my first Kathe Koja and I now need to read all of her other horror novels. I've already picked up a couple of them and I still need to track down a couple more, but I am loving her writing and yeah, highly recommend The Cipher. Next up I read The Pillow Friend by Lisa Tuttle. This is about a character called Agnes. We follow her throughout her life. We start off, I think she's just coming up to her 7th birthday in the 1960s, and she receives this small doll as a birthday present, and she's told that this doll will be her pillow friend, in that it will be someone she can talk to and will tell her stories. And the premise of this book gave the indication that this would lead to her kind of building an imaginary relationship with this doll, and that was something that followed her throughout her life, her becoming kind of more insular and involved with these imaginary friends rather than real life. And the book was actually quite different to that. I'd also seen this labelled as horror, and it kind of dips a toe in horror, but I wouldn't say it was really a straight up horror novel. It's definitely much more literary. I would even just call it straight fiction rather than genre fiction. But the horror that is in it is more psychological. So it was a bit different to what I was expecting, but I still quite enjoyed it. We basically follow Agnes throughout her life as she gets older, different things that happen to her, different relationships she has, and some of it definitely had a psychological, disturbing undertone to it, whereas a lot of it was just straight up fiction about this woman's life. There were parts of this story that I really enjoyed. Her writing is definitely fantastic. I really enjoyed her writing style, but some parts of the story I did feel got a bit slow and drawn out, and it does feel a little disjointed as the story kind of takes different turns. It's almost like a short story collection in a way, in that each chapter kind of seems to follow a different segment, and some of them are quite different in tone, but it is a story that flows throughout the whole book. So this was a little different to what I was expecting. I still quite enjoyed it. I gave it 3 stars. And I definitely do want to read more by Lisa Tuttle. I think she has written mostly within horror, fantasy and sci-fi. I'm definitely keen to find some more of her horror writing, so if you've read any and you have any recommendations, I would love to hear about them. So yeah, this one was 3 stars from me. Next up I read We Sold Our Souls by Grady Hendrix. This is his most recent novel and it just came out earlier in September, and I got a copy of this from NetGalley, and this was such a great read. I really enjoyed it. This is about Chris. She was part of a 90s heavy metal band, and just before they really made it big, the lead singer Terry decided to leave the band and set off on a solo career, and now in the present day he is still hugely famous and successful, and Chris meanwhile is working a crappy job at a Best Western hotel and generally not having the best life. And one day Chris sees a bunch of huge billboards advertising Terry's new tour, and this just brings back a lot of feelings for her and how things went down with the breakup of the band. And she realises there are just so many unanswered questions from that time and what exactly happened. And she decides to track down the other members of the band, Dirtwork, with umlauts of course, and try and get some answers, and ultimately find Terry and try and resolve what happened to them all in the past. And the more she finds out from her old bandmates, the more she realises that something strange really did happen one night which led to the breakup of the band, and Terry actually sold their souls in exchange for his own fame and fortune. This is such a great, fast-paced story. I definitely connected with Chris. She was such a realistic and believable character, and I totally related to that whole feeling like you're caught under the wheels of life and her struggle with coming to terms with what happened to her in the past and where she is today. Grady Hendrix definitely did his research into heavy metal, and it definitely showed. The attention to detail and the observations that he made were absolutely spot on, and it definitely made it a believable and enjoyable read. Another thing I really like about his writing is how he manages to balance the light-hearted, fun and funny with a more serious side, and you know, there are implications, there is a heartfelt aspect to the story, there is a message. So yeah, the balancing of the two I thought was really well done. So I think this has a bit of something for everyone. If you're a horror fan, there's definitely some horror in here and a couple of pretty gory scenes. And if you're not a big horror fan, there's enough of other stuff going on that I think you would really enjoy it too. And it also made me cry a bit at the end. So yeah, it had it all going on, and I think this was an excellent read. Definitely recommend it. I gave it 4 stars. Next up, I read another new release. This was The Bus on Thursday by Shirley Barrett. This was another one that came out in September and one that I got from NetGalley. This is described as Bridget Jones meets The Exorcist, and I thought that just sounded like a really interesting concept and was one that I was looking forward to checking out. The story is about a 30-something-year-old woman who is recovering from breast cancer and also a breakup, and she decides to have a fresh start. She moves to a really small town in the middle of nowhere to take up a job as a teacher at the local school. And things are definitely a bit strange in this town. First off, the previous teacher whose job she is replacing has mysteriously disappeared, and the other inhabitants of the town are all a bit odd. I ended up not finishing this book. It just wasn't for me, unfortunately. I have never read Bridget Jones's Diary. I've never read any chick lit or anything, you know, within that type of genre. It's just not something that has appealed to me. But this story sounded interesting and I thought I'd give it a go. I thought it would be something a bit different to what I usually read. And yeah, unfortunately this is probably why I've never gravitated towards chick lit, because it just isn't my thing. The main character is very snarky and sarcastic, and while I do love that kind of humour, it just fell really flat for me in this book. There were a couple of interesting things that happened in the story that kind of kept me turning the pages, but after a while I found myself skimming it in order to get to the next interesting plot point, and unfortunately they were a bit few and far between for me. And I managed to get to 40%, so I gave it over a third of the way, and I just knew it wasn't working for me. but I'd seen some really great reviews of this, so I had a quick glance at Goodreads just to see, you know, what was I missing. And it turns out that everyone that really enjoyed this book loved the main character. They thought she was hilarious. So the fact that I didn't feel that way meant I was really missing out on a big part of the appeal of this story. So it just turns out it wasn't my cup of tea. I ended up not finishing it. The portion that I did read, I really could only give 2 stars to because I didn't enjoy it. But it clearly does have a lot of fans out there, so if it sounds like your thing, then I'd still give it a go. Next up, I read The Long Walk by Stephen King. I listened to the audiobook version of this, which was narrated by Kirby Hayborn, and this is about an annual event called The Long Walk. It's set in a dystopian future, and each year 100 teenage boys are selected to take part, and they have to keep walking at a pace of 4 miles an hour, and if they drop below that they get a warning, and after I think it's 3 warnings they're out. And the winner is given anything he wants for the rest of his life. And this, I believe, was Stephen King's first novel that he wrote, and it was originally published under his pseudonym Richard Bachman. And this was one I'd been wanting to read for a while and finally checked out, and I thought I'd give the audio version a go. And I wonder if I might have enjoyed it more had I read the physical book. I didn't fully enjoy the narrator's voice. I did like it from time to time, but I'm not sure it worked for me 100%. Things I really liked about the story were the interactions between the characters. They did feel believable, and it was really interesting to see as the walk goes on how they quickly form friendships and enemies, and how that affects the whole experience for them. We learn more about them as individuals and their motivations for taking part, and I thought all of that was really good. It definitely had some disturbing moments throughout the story, but the things I didn't quite like was it did feel quite drawn out, and I realised that's kind of silly to say so when it's called The Long Walk. It's meant to be fairly drawn out and bound to be repetitive at times, but it didn't really make the experience enjoyable or really hold my attention fully, unfortunately. And another thing was some of the characters kind of merged into one. I did have a bit of a hard time differentiating between them. That was possibly because of the narrator voicing them all, and yes, he did try and do some different voices, but there are so many characters it was difficult to really remember them as individuals. So I'm glad I gave this one a go, but it did end up being a bit of a mixed bag for me, so I ended up giving it 3 stars. Next up, I read White is for Witching by Helen Oyeyemi. This is about a teenage girl called Miranda. She suffers from a disorder called pica, which means she eats things that aren't meant to be eaten, and she has a particular thing for chalk, and she has been away for a while in order to recover from this, and now she's returned back home with her brother and father, who live in a large building which used to be their mother's, who has passed away, and now their father has turned it into a bed and breakfast. This was also a bit of a mixed bag for me. There was a really creepy quote that I had read a while ago before reading this book that had me really intrigued and excited for reading it, but sadly those moments didn't feature very heavily in the book. There were definitely a few creepy and unsettling moments, but it didn't feature as heavily as I wanted. Things I really liked about this were the writing format. It's quite different, it's probably not going to be for everyone, but I really liked it. It is told from different perspectives, so sometimes it is a bit confusing as to who you're reading from. Another interesting way she writes is using the last word of a sentence that becomes the first word in another sentence from a different person's perspective. I really liked that too. Unfortunately, the story itself just didn't really hold my interest. There were moments that I was really into, but then quite long stretches where I just felt the story meandered. The characters of Miranda, her brother and father, I didn't really like any of them, so I just didn't really care about them. I not only didn't like them, I just didn't find them interesting. Like, I'm totally okay with unlikable characters as long as there's something about them that I'm going to like reading. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough here for me to enjoy reading about them. There are some other characters that we're introduced to and I really enjoyed reading about them, but they were smaller parts of the story, so that was kind of a shame. So yeah, this was a bit of a disappointment for me. I was expecting to love it and I kind of ended it wishing I'd liked it more than I did. I did like certain things about it, but overall I gave it 3 stars. I would definitely be interested to read more of her work because she's definitely talented, but this particular book was kind of a mixed experience for me. I also started reading October Dreams, which is an anthology collection by various different horror authors all about October and Halloween, and I've read maybe about 100 or so pages of this, and I think it's about 600 or so pages long, and I've been enjoying it so far. It's definitely starting to get me in the Halloween spirit, and as with any short story collection, some of the stories are better than others, but overall I've been enjoying it and I will be continuing this during the month of October. And last up, I read a little bit more of Dracula, the new annotated Dracula, and this was one that I picked up in January of this year, and I had the bright idea of reading a bit of it each month and getting through it by the end of the year, and I think I did that for a few months and then I put it down and I haven't picked it up since. So yeah, I had a bit of time at the end of September and I thought I'm going to read a bit more of this if it kills me. So this is a reread of Dracula for me, but it's my first read of this annotated edition, and yeah, I'm enjoying it. I still have quite a way to go if I'm going to finish it by the end of the year, so I really should get my skates on, but yeah, I'm glad I picked this one up again for a bit this month and carried on with it. So that was everything I read in September. A bit of a mixed month, not my best but probably not my worst either, so I definitely can't complain. Definitely the highlight for me was the Cipher by Kathe Koja, and another one that I really enjoyed was We Sold Our Souls by Grady Hendrix. Let me know if you've read any of these or tell me what you've been reading recently. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and hopefully I will see you again in my next video. Bye!